Welcome to this episode of SDI Encounters, a podcast from SDI, the home of spiritual companionship. I'm Matt Whitney. Thank you for listening. Learn more about our work and the work of spiritual companionship on our website, sdicompanions.org. There are many attempts at categorizing those walking a path of spiritual freedom. We see and use broad terms such as spiritual independence, spiritual but not religious, the nuns. I've even heard recently the duns, people who have left their religious tradition, their spiritual orientation of their upbringing. They're done with it. These categories, as any, are ultimately limiting. As spiritual directors and companions, we know and understand that each person's spiritual story is unique, regardless of their spiritual tradition and orientation. So all that said, how do we companion the spiritual explorer, the wayfarer, who has left the religion of their upbringing, or practices more than one religion, or does not see themselves as rooted in any particular religious tradition? How do we nurture the increased spiritual curiosity and playfulness our companions bring to their sessions with us? How do we help others navigate the rejection of an upbringing or subjection to a religion that they found stunted or even harmful? What if that tradition they've left behind is one that we, the spiritual director, cherish? These questions are the underpinnings of our new online series from SDI, Seeking Spiritual Freedom, exploring how we companion those who have entered the spiritual wilderness and earnestly tread a wayless path that is beyond what they know and possibly what others have known. However one's unique journey manifests, the diversity of the paths walked by those we companion will only continue to grow. So in this podcast, I talk with all our presenters for this series. I ask them about their work and service to others, how they understand the path of spiritual freedom, and what you can expect from our upcoming series, which you can register for now on our website, sdicompanions.org. I will introduce each of our presenters as we go. Reverend Dr. Khadija Mateen has established a solid record of commitment to education and faith-based organizations, serving in multiple leadership roles. Building upon her interests in her family history and social justice work, Khadija's work looks at the role family and faith history plays as identity and transformation models. Khadija has an MS from Fordham University, certificates from One Spirit Seminary, ISC program. She earned her DMin in 2012 from New York Theological Seminary in multi-faith ministry. Always inspired by her children, Khadija is called by some as a woman who walks through walls and calling as a continuation of her family's traditions, fulfilling the social justice dreams of her ancestors.
I've done a tremendous amount of work in terms of interfaith and interspiritual, the communities and educating. My doctorate is in multi-faith studies. And I've looked at it from the perspective of not only just a person's faith, but how does their faith or spiritual journey, how is it informed by their family's geographical, historical, and social journeys? And so it's not looking at it like it's this thing over there, but an integral part of the identity of anyone. A lot of the work that I do is how do we come to terms with our sense of ourself and spirit, and with the context, with a socially just context of a freed identity, not an identity imposed through colonization or any of the other kinds of ways that someone wants to tell us how we're supposed to be. I look at the phrase spiritually independent. I have some challenges with that terminology, and in the session, I will explore what happens when there's more tags applied to this human journey. That a lot of people who may appear to be spiritually independent may actually still be connected to their faith of origin, but they're finding their path. They're finding their way to be engaged with the interpretation of spirit. So in the workshop, I will even raise some questions about, do we need to be careful with the phrasing and the terminology and all the other terms for those who don't appear to be associated with a faith community? Because sometimes even putting the tags is another way of narrowing the possibility of that person's journey. They'll spend energy resisting the tag, and as opposed to exploring their conversation with God, Allah, the Great Spirit, or any other way that they want to engage. I also think that if I was working with someone who did identify as such or was exploring, one of the things that people know when you work with me, you have to engage sacred texts, but not just the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, or the typical, but that maybe the sacred message could come from a comic book. Maybe the sacred message is a book of poems. Maybe it's something that you read by one of the significant poets or authors, and there's that paragraph in the middle of the book that changes your whole sense of awareness with spirit, with God. And then also, how do you engage your core beliefs with the greater, broader community? I come from a family of Muslims and Christians. We've traced our heritage to 1619. And as Islam is my core faith, I also have conversations with people of other traditions and customs, because socially and politically, what is it that we wish for, not only ourselves, but the broader community? So there's a lot of social justice and environmental and seeing the earth as sacred, and what does that mean? So I hope that when I do engage those in the workshop, that I will have them look at less tags, more ways to expand the associations that anyone brings to the conversation, and moving away from narrowing terminology, such as identifying Christianity or Islam as the traditional religious institutions, but rather look at the expansiveness that exists in all the faith traditions. And so it's really, how do we bring this awareness? You don't know the road that you're traveling on. The person, regardless of their age, who may be a person who's 80 and saying, I think I might be a spiritually independent, or it might be the 16-year-old. The journey is a journey. It's a journey. It could be unpredictable. And in guiding them in spiritual companioning, it's helping them pave that pathway. It's helping them see that through their lens, as opposed to imposing, well, therefore you must be. Because, well, that's another way of imposing our bias or discrimination on someone. And it could be a way to squeeze their heart. And what we want to do is open it up. I hope that helps.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's clarifying and expansive. And it's really all I can ask for. And I don't even want to ask you any more questions because I want to wait for the session.
Okay.
But I'm going to ask you one more. I don't know if I'll use it.
All right.
But because I think about this question a lot, and you touched on it, even describing this webinar, I'm talking about spiritual independence, spiritual but not religious, the spiritual nuns or the spiritual duns. And you mentioned that those terms are, those categories are limiting, right? And I just wonder how you talk about, I think what I'm hearing you say is that like the spiritual journey is as unique as each individual on the planet is. And so, yeah, how do you talk about these journeys that we're on?
Well, I see myself as always on this journey. And as you sit with people and talk with them, and a lot of the work that I've done is having them do their family history, their family faith journey, as well as the family's geographical journeys and the kind of work that they did, the levels of education, and then what is spirit through all of that. So it's really having people look at that who they are is not these boxes or compartments. They really are this conversation with that greater spirit, however you want to call it. I call it Allah. Someone else may call it something else, but it's the conversation that we're having, the engaged conversation. And so that's why when someone uses a phrase, I'll ask them, well, what does that phrase mean to you? How does it resonate with you? Does it resonate? How does it make your heart feel? How does it feel in your gut? And what does it say when someone else is telling you what you are, as opposed to you identifying? Identity is the one way in which any human being can claim who they are. And the minute we fall into an assumption about phrases, we're restricting the realm of possibility and greatness for that individual. So, and then you have to look at the social times that we're in or have been in the past and recognize, and I do believe this, that we influence the next 7 generations, just like the 7 ones behind us influence how we show up. So we really need to understand, what are we doing that will ensure a freed identity, a sense of connection to God or Allah or spirit, that will ensure that we are stewards of the earth and that we will sustain a good earth. So it's not pieces that are disjointed. It is all absolutely connected. And that's why I say sacred text could be the Quran, it could be the Bible, it could be a translation or a conversation. And it could also be, and I've seen it, some straight up comic books. Take it right to the heart.
Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you for your response to that. I'm very taken by the notion of, like, my spiritual journey is a conversation, right? A conversation with spirit, but with also the tradition of my upbringing, my
Right,
ancestors, the people who
right,
come after me, my children, grandchildren, great grandchildren,
right,
and our times
right.
as well. Our times and current events and with the earth, all of it. It's all
All of it.
conversation. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's a continuing conversation.
Frank Owen earned a Master of Arts in Transpersonal Counseling Psychology from Naropa University in the mid-90s, with a focus in Jungian psychology, eco-psychology, and Gestalt studies. Additionally, he pursued postgraduate studies in Jungian dream body work, spiritual direction, and spiritually integrated psychotherapy, a year-long course of study developed by the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. In his work with others, he adheres to a transpersonal orientation, i.e., we are more than only body and mind, and we are more than the sum of our parts, and an interfaith ethic of hospitality in which he supports each person, whatever their spiritual or religious path, or if there is none. So, Frank Owen, thank you for your time here, and excited to have you as a presenter for our Seeking Spiritual Freedom series. Wonder if you could just share a little bit about your work in the world as a spiritual companion.
Sure, sure. Well, my work I refer to as contemplative soul work. My nickname for it and my brand is soulfaring. And I work with a variety of people from very different backgrounds, chaplains in training, psychotherapists who are looking for a spiritual companion in their own evolving spiritual formation. I've worked with individuals who come from a Zen background, even Zen monastics, as well as individuals who are from a Christian background, largely Episcopal, Presbyterian, as well as United Methodist. And then the other population I would say that I work with, although I don't advertise this, it tends to be a theme that arises, are people that have experienced spiritual abuse, perhaps at the hands of a recognized spiritual teacher, or who have even experienced what we might call community scapegoating when they were the individual who raised the flag, so to speak, on some abuse issues within their spiritual community. So that is a sort of a growing group that I've been working with, addressing that, essentially what I think of as a kind of religious trauma. And then how that dovetails with their own spiritual formation process then around, well, what does their path look like now that they've stepped out of what had been a spiritual container for them?
Yes, I resonate with what you're sharing on
Yeah.
the religious trauma and coming out of spiritual languages and systems and institutions that were harmful to them, and many of us continue to have to work on those wounds, right?
Right. So I would have to say that, like, part of the group I work with are people who are attending others who may be working with those themes, and others who are actively working with those experiences and themes in their own life. So,
Yeah. Thank you for that work.
mm.
So the series is on, broadly speaking, walking with spiritual independence and, whatever the term, the spiritual nuns, the spiritual but not religious. And it seems like you resonate with the term wayfarer. And so maybe you could share a little bit about how you understand the path of the wayfarer or the spirituality of the wayfarer.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, that term gets thrown around and used in different ways by different people. For instance, I have very dear friends who have done the pilgrimage of Santiago de Compostela across Spain, the El Camino, which means the way. So people that do that pilgrimage will sometimes refer to themselves or each other as a wayfarer. But then, of course, the term is also used by some people in Taoism, because the word Tao means way or path. And so a wayfarer in that context is someone who is following or working with the Tao. Of course, you also see that in Zen, and people are referring to the Zen path and a person who's on the Zen path as a wayfarer. Where I encountered a more broad understanding and use of this term was my late teacher, who was very much she was a wayfarer herself. And she didn't use this term in a narrow sense specific to one tradition, but rather as a kind of archetype for people who are going their own way, spiritually speaking. And those people may brush sleeves with different traditions or incorporate different practices from different traditions. A kind of syncretic alchemy, maybe, is a way of thinking about it. And for her and for me as well, because I studied with her and really absorbed a lot from her in this regard, when a person feels a calling to that path, it tends to activate a process in a person's life. And so a lot of the work that I do personally, but also in terms of my own spiritual path, has been attending to that unfolding process that gets activated. That's a kind of calling. And so rather than looking for external structures or scaffolding or even messages from another tradition per se, it's paying attention to what is emerging from the deep self, to use some Jungian language. And so I kind of have come to see wayfaring as really an extension of the individuation process, but specific within the context of spirituality.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, for your explanation. So you'll be presenting here for the first session of this series, Seeking Spiritual Freedom. And so can you share a little bit about what folks can expect in that session?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about this term wayfarer and kind of reviewing a little bit of what I just said about how it's used in specific ways, but also in more broad ways. But also the notion of studying other wayfarers, people who are kind of embodiments of this wayfaring archetype. And I want to do that in a way that not a deep dive biographically, but introducing different prototypes of individuals who embody that wayfaring archetype. Some from the East, some from the West, some that are ancient, some that are more contemporary, touchstones that many people will have heard of, but who I consider to be a wayfarer in that they following deeply this process that's been activated within them. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the issues that can arise for a spiritual independent. Some of that might be psycho-spiritual challenges, states of consciousness, of disorientation, even confusion, aspects of, potentially grief, that can be activated in the wayfaring process. And so then also the topic of pitfalls, things where we can get sideways with ourselves, where actually this is where a spiritual director or spiritual companion can be a vital resource for someone that has been trying to go their own way, but perhaps gets into a place of confusion or even this concept spiritual bypassing, kind of not looking at some of the issues that may need to be addressed on the personal level as part of that.
Reverend Dana Edwards is called to a ministry of love, creativity, and justice. Currently, she serves as the Minister of Faith Formation at Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Congregation. She's passionate about finding ways to connect people with each other, with the divine, and with their own inner knowing. Dana looks for joy, beauty, and the sacred in the everydayness of life. Her ministry is rooted in creating and sustaining intergenerational relationships. She lives in Prince George's County, Maryland, with her 3 children. Well, Reverend Dana, thank you for your time. Can you maybe share a little bit about your work as a spiritual director and as a UU minister and what that looks like?
Yeah, so I actually started as a religious professional about 13 years ago, and kind of came to a crossroad in my own path where I was spiritual but not religious. And someone sat down with me and I was like, well, I kind of believe in what Unitarian Universalists believe, but there's some problematic pieces of that religion that I'm not sure about. So that's why I identify as spiritual, but not religious. And that particular person was like, well, no, if that's how you identify, you should take the time to be a part of that faith and make that faith better, and make it live into its calling. And so that was my first call to ministry. Which I didn't listen to. And then, over the course of 10 years from that point on, I had different calls that came. And then finally, in the fall of 2016, felt like the arc of the moral universe was not bending towards justice, but maybe away from justice. And so felt called to pursue ministry and entered seminary. And And so that's how I became a Unitarian Universalist minister. And I was ordained in 2021 at the height of the pandemic, and started my spiritual direction work a little bit after that, because I noticed one of the things I loved the most was doing pastoral care and sitting with people and helping them answer the big questions in their lives, or helping them make meaning out of situations that seem to have no meaning. And so from there, I kind of developed my spiritual direction practice. I also found my own spiritual director because, as with many people during that time, was trying to make meaning of a global pandemic and parenthood, and life, and found my own spiritual director was really helpful in kind of helping me determine a spiritually grounded way forward. And so I want to be able to do that same work with others. And so primarily now I work with other religious professionals in spiritual direction who are either working through identity issues or working through conflict in their lives in some place. And I really find that putting a spiritual lens on conflict really helps people move through it and not get stuck in it. And just helping people just think about and make meaning of those big questions that we all have in life.
Yeah, I love that. That's how I got into it too. Just what big questions. How are people responding to them and living out those questions? It's always been a deep curiosity. I hear that in you too. We should. So you talk about being spiritual but not religious, and this series that we're offering is on walking this path of spiritual freedom, being spiritually independent, spiritual but not religious, spiritual none, however one might name it. And what does that mean to you, being spiritually independent?
That's a really good, big question. I think the impulse is to be like, oh, I'm spiritually independent. I can believe whatever I want to believe. I can do whatever I want to do. But what I find is that actually being spiritually independent, or not being tied to a creed, like not being tied to a creedal faith, actually requires more discipline and more practice. It requires you to think more deeply about your own morals and ethics in a way that sometimes a creedal faith can just give you the answers, or can point you towards like one sacred book and say, this book has all the answers. And if you're spiritually independent, you're looking more towards like, well, this book says this and this book says this. Now I have to kind of integrate both of these books and figure out what I think, figure out what I believe. What does my truth sound like knowing these? And are there more books I should be reading, or more experiences I should be having to deepen my understanding of whatever that big question is?
That's such a brilliant answer. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, spiritual freedom actually requires a lot of rigor, a lot of sort of inner work, contemplation, building that moral framework, an ethical framework. Wow. Yeah, that's so well put. So thank you for that answer. So maybe you could share a little bit about what you want to share with folks in your session for this series.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can have, as much as the Zoom class allows, a discussion and make some meaning together about how to serve people and how to be in companionship with people on a spiritual journey who are spiritually independent, And like I said before, I really believe that that's about listening for what is the person's big question and helping them figure out what resources they have in their lives to help answer that question. An example that just came to mind is for myself that I might talk deeper about in the class is I grew up spiritual but not religious, but my parents were active in the labor movement. And so a lot of my identity, my spiritual identity is tied up with justice as a spiritual practice. And so one example of that is a mural that this organization painted on the side of the wall of a wall in Boston that as a child I saw go from the very beginning phases all the way to the completed mural, and I was able to help paint it, and it had all these labor movement figures on it. And so during that time, I asked questions about who is this, and people told stories about who is, this labor movement person, who is that labor movement person. And that for me was formative of my spiritual journey. Like these were the people I looked up to and turned to when I had questions as I got older, and looked to in books like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman. And then when I was raising my own daughter, we went to George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. And we were able to look at the murals and the paintings that people did there and the artwork that people did there as acts of resistance against the oppression of the police and the police state. And seeing her make meaning from that artwork the same way I had made meaning from artwork as a child was a way for us to do spiritual formation work together. And so bringing that type of spiritual text into a spiritual direction, conversation, or container is one way that you can help people who are spiritually independent make spiritual meaning out of things that seem secular.
Bryce Woyak has spent most of his life studying various religions and sacred traditions in search for the boundlessness of the sacred. He has a BA in Religious Studies with a certificate in Celtic Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a Master of Divinity with concentration in Pastoral Counseling and Chaplaincy from Cherry Hill Seminary, and a certificate in Spiritual Direction from Cherry Hill. Driven by a call to serve his community, he combines his mystic heart with his training in clinical spiritual care to offer empathic and research-driven spiritual support. He is a Wiccan high priest and coven leader of the Alexandrian tradition, as well as a legally ordained minister through Covenant of the Goddess. He is a board-certified chaplain working full-time in hospice. Okay, well, Bryce, thank you for your time, and thank you for being a part of this series, Seeking Spiritual Freedom.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Matt, for the invitation, and thank you, SGI, as the great organization, for the invitation. I'm very excited to be part of this series and to share some of my background with other colleagues and to hear some of theirs. I'm really excited for the co-creative space we're going to embark in.
Oh, beautiful. Well, tell us a little bit about your work in the world as a spiritual companion and everything in between.
Yeah, so I am, my daytime job is as a board certified chaplain for a hospice organization. I currently work at a branch of Bristol Hospice over in Madison, Wisconsin. And then my evening job looks like jumping into private sessions with spiritual direction clients and facilitating those. I've been in the broad spectrum of spiritual care, from healthcare to spiritual direction, for about 6 years now.
Great. And so you cover a lot of ground in your work, tending to people, and in your work as a hospice chaplain, serve a lot of people with a lot of different spiritual backgrounds. And this series is about walking with people whom identify as being on an independent path, right? So we have these category terms: spiritual independent, spiritual but not religious. spiritual nuns or duns, done with the tradition of their upbringing. And so my question, Bryce, is just how do you understand that path? Like, what is it? What do you think it means to be spiritually independent?
In my experience in spiritual care, both in the medical setting and outside of the medical setting in the private spiritual direction practice, I've really appreciated the gifts that I've gotten from those spiritual independents, whether they identify as spiritual but not religious, nuns. Done is a new term for me, but I really like that. I think that a lot of people would find that sort of tongue-in-cheek, playful enough to enter into a spiritual relationship with it. And what I've taken away from that is that at some level, we're all a spiritual independent or we're all interspiritual within us. I'm really thankful to Dick Schwartz and his founding of Internal Family Systems and the work that they do there about the idea that we're made up of many different parts. And these different parts have relationships, they have needs, and our parts are in community with one another, looking for someone to hold us all together. And what I have found in people, even people who claim to have a single religious faith, spiritual tradition, is that there are parts with different spiritual needs, and that there is this interspirituality that exists internally within them. And I learned a lot about what that looks like inside by listening to people who were in the hospital who didn't have a faith background or a spiritual background that they could lean into for comfort at that time, and had to figure out what parts of me am I in conversation with right now? Is that my autonomy? Is that who I am as a parent? Is that who I want to be as a person that is virtuous in society? And so when thinking about spiritual independent, I really look at it as spiritual, interspiritual, that we're entering into interspiritual spaces, both internally and externally. I think that I've gotten a real gift from people in my life who don't identify with a specific spiritual tradition or faith tradition, and instead identify as those spiritual but not religious, or interspiritual, or spiritually fluid, because there's so much depth of navigation and curiosity there that speaks to my own mystic heart. And I get really excited thinking about how that works internally with both the patients that I serve and the spiritual direction clients that I companion, about what are their different parts. And even if they find themselves rooted in the spiritual tradition, how do those different parts maybe have different spiritual needs that they're constantly navigating? So if I have a client who is very much rooted in Lutheran Christianity, they likely have a part that wants structure. They likely have a part that wants mysticism. They likely have a part that wants to blaspheme. And so we're constantly in this interspiritual dialogue internally within that client. And that really comes out when working one-on-one with people in a spiritual direction setting where now it's external. I show up as somebody who has my own spiritual grounding. I have my own beliefs. I have my own history. And I'm bringing it to sit in front of somebody who has all of their identity that's their own as well. And we're creating that interspiritual dynamic space by which we can engage in curiosity and use that curiosity to really explore what is sacred to that person I'm companioning at a deeper level.
Beautifully said. And I hear you sharing this mystic heart and in the commonalities between traditions and religious frameworks, and how we can connect across perceived differences. And it sounds to me like you're very rooted in this work of interspiritual, interfaith dialogue, and maybe you have to be because of your vocational work.
Yeah, I would definitely say I'm very rooted in interspiritual work, and that's how I describe what I do as a chaplain and as a spiritual director as well, is that I work in interspiritual spaces. I'm an interspiritual care provider. I want to highlight just something that you had said about the connection and the similarities that exist between spiritualities and the human experience, because I think that's really important to recognize in interspiritual spaces, that there are some core commonalities of being human that show up in every spirituality. I would welcome to say, right, we all live, we all die. We can at least start there and say these are common experiences. What's also important, though, is that we don't forget the differences. There are differences between somebody who is rooted in a tradition and somebody who has a more seeker mentality, who might not have one tradition or who might go between multiple traditions at the same time. The differences are important and deserve to be respected as well as part of the identity, as part of their own autonomous story, as something that's sacred to them. I found that in my own story that myself being of a different religious background from a lot of people that I work with, that there has been a lot of restoring trying to tell me how, oh, what I do is very similar to what they do. And I think what we end up doing at the end of the day is both very human, and we go about being human in different ways. And both of those are true and deserving of respect.
You named being, walking up in your own tradition, one that's not particularly common amongst most folks, and being rooted in that tradition, and but also being open to other people and being able to receive other people and what they bring from their own traditions. And I hear that there is a fluidity, there is an exchange of energies, of ideas, of wisdom. Why I'm so excited for your session, Bryce, is how, when we talk about walking with people on an independent path, it doesn't mean that we have to become, we don't have to change who we are necessarily, right? We can be ourselves on our own paths, but our paths can run parallel to each other. They can even overlap, and there's a mutuality there.
Absolutely. The word that comes to my mind is tapestry. There's a beautiful tapestry of intersections that all life has. And those threads that we cross help to make the picture what it is. And so being able to use our own groundedness and our own spirituality to become curious about somebody else's spiritual practices is a way of overlapping those threads that leads to a greater picture. And I think leads to something more beautiful in the world. And that's kind of what the take we're going to be taking in the session that I'll be leading. We'll go through some exercises and really explore where is our own internal interspirituality, and how do we lean into the allies from our spiritual grounding that teach us about that internal system. And in doing so, how can we remain authentically rooted, connected to those allies to generate an authentic curiosity about the seeker that's sitting in front of us, regardless of what their spiritual tradition is?
If you're enjoying this podcast and you want to help us share and spread the word about the life-giving practice of spiritual companionship, you can help us out by subscribing to this podcast through your favorite app. You could give us a like or even write us a review. Thank you for listening. This is Matt Whitney with Spiritual Directors International. Thanks again for listening. Your time and your presence here are deeply appreciated. If you liked this show and would like us to continue making them, please do subscribe now while it's fresh on your mind. Also, we would love to hear from you, so please feel free to send in your comments and suggestions to the email address podcast@sdiworld.org. SDI is the home of spiritual companionship. Learn more about us and our work on our website, sdicompanions.org.